Her fingers dug into his arm like she was drowning, and he was the only piece of driftwood left in the water. "Don't let them sell my house," she gasped, an oxygen tank rattling on its cart behind her, eyes wild with a fear that had nothing to do with her failing lungs. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know about the nephew, the forged trust, the house closing in 9 days. All he knew was that a stranger, desperate and dying by inches, had chosen him, a man everyone else crossed the street to avoid, as her last hope. He should have walked away. Everyone expected him to. What he did instead would tear a family apart, expose a betrayal years in the making, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous-looking man in the room is the only one still willing to listen. The gas station on Charlotte Pike smelled like rain on hot asphalt, and Dwayne Kessler was counting the minutes until his shift on the road ended for the day. He'd pulled off Interstate 40 for fuel and coffee, his Harley ticking as it cooled beside Pump 3, the Nashville skyline a grey smear behind low clouds. At 6'3", with a greying beard and forearms mapped in faded ink, Dwayne drew the kind of looks he'd stopped noticing years ago. Mothers steering children to the far side of the sidewalk, a cashier who suddenly needed to restock cigarettes the moment he walked in. He was used to it. 22 years riding with the Iron Veterans Motorcycle Club, a group of ex-military and blue-collar men who spent more time doing charity poker runs for burn units than anything the movies like to imagine, had taught him that most people's fear said more about their assumptions than about him. He no longer tried to correct it. He just paid for his coffee, nodded once, and moved on with his day. That morning, he almost didn't stop at all. But the oil light had blinked twice on the highway, and he wanted to check the levels before he got back on the interstate toward his brother's place in Murfreesboro. He was crouched by his bike, wiping the dipstick on a rag, when he heard the wheeze of a portable oxygen concentrator and the soft scrape of orthopedic shoes on concrete. "Young man." He looked up. An elderly woman stood a few feet away, thin as a fence post, silver hair pinned back with a comb that had probably cost more than his first car back when it was new. A clear tube ran from her nose to a small tank clipped to a wheeled cart, and her cardigan, buttoned wrong by one hole, hung loose on her shoulders. She held a canvas tote bag stuffed with what looked like folders. "Ma'am," Dwayne said, straightening slowly, the way he'd learned to move around people who startled easy. "You need help finding somebody. You're a ways from the store entrance." She didn't answer the question. Instead, she crossed the remaining distance faster than her tank and her lungs should have allowed, and she grabbed his forearm, grabbed it hard, her fingers cold and thin, but locked like a vice, nails pressing crescents into his skin through his jacket sleeve. "Don't let them sell my house." Dwayne went still. Up close, he could see her eyes were sharp, not clouded with confusion the way he'd half expected. Scared, yes. Desperate, but lucid. Whatever this was, it wasn't dementia talking. "Ma'am, I don't know you," he said carefully. "I think you might have me confused with somebody." "I know exactly who you are," she said, and her voice cracked. Not with weakness, but with something closer to fury held too long at bay. "You're the only person who's stopped for me in 3 days. Everyone else walks around me like I'm a shopping cart, somebody left in the lot." That landed somewhere in Dwayne's chest. He didn't examine too closely. He glanced toward the store window, half expecting a manager to come out and shoo her along, or a family member to jog over apologizing for Grandma wandering off. Nobody came. "What's your name?" he asked. "Beatrice Holloway." She let go of his arm, seemingly satisfied that he wasn't going to shake her off, and pressed a hand to her chest to catch her breath. The concentrator hummed at her hip. "I live on Talbot Street, lived there 51 years. My husband built the porch swing himself in 1974, and it's still there, still holds, and I will be damned if anyone takes it down." "Okay," Dwayne said slowly. "Who's trying to take it down?" Beatrice's jaw tightened. "My nephew, Randall." He has power of attorney. Got me to sign it 2 years ago when I had the pneumonia and wasn't thinking straight. And now he's telling everyone I can't live alone, that the house needs to be sold for my care. And he's already got a buyer, some company, cash offer, quick close, the whole thing wrapped up before I can even talk to my own lawyer. Her hands were shaking now, whether from the exertion or from anger, Dwayne couldn't tell. I called the police. They said it's a civil matter. I called a lawyer. She wants $4,000 I don't have because Randall froze the account he has access to. I have 12 days before the closing date. Dwayne looked at her, really looked, and thought of his own grandmother, who'd raised him after his father shipped out and never came back the same, who died in a state facility because nobody in the family had time to check on her more than twice a year. He thought about how many people walked past this woman at this gas station, on this street, in this city, and decided a stranger with tattoos and a leather cut wasn't worth stopping for, while a woman in a cardigan buttoned crooked was fighting for her home with a canvas bag of paperwork and a tank that was running low. "Miss Beatrice," he said, "why'd you grab my arm, out of everybody here?" She looked at him like the answer was obvious. "Because everybody else looked through me. You looked at me." Dwayne exhaled slowly. He thought about the ride to Murfreesboro, about the six-pack waiting in his brother's fridge, about minding his own business the way 22 years of hard-won peace had taught him to. Then he crouched down, picked up the oil rag, wiped his hands and said, "Let's see that paperwork." They sat at a plastic table outside the gas station's side entrance, Beatrice's oxygen tank humming between them like a tired engine, while she spread folders across the surface with hands that trembled from more than the exertion. Dwayne read through page after page, a power of attorney document dated 2 years prior, a real estate listing already active online with a "coming soon" banner, and a letter from a company called Meridian Home Solutions offering 40% below what a similar house 3 doors down had sold for the previous spring. "That's a lowball," Dwayne said, tapping the offer letter. "That's not even close to market." "Randall says it's a fair cash price for a house that needs work," Beatrice said bitterly. "The roof's 12 years old, nothing wrong with it. He just wants it gone fast." Dwayne had seen this pattern before, not personally, but through the club. 2 years back, one of the Iron veterans, a man named Roy Ferris, who'd done 3 tours and came home with a bad hip and a good heart, had helped an elderly neighbor fight off a similar scheme when her son tried to get her declared incompetent to seize her military survivor's benefits. Roy had connections. A legal aid attorney who did pro bono work for veterans and elderly homeowners, a retired judge who still consulted informally, and a network of guys who knew how to make paperwork move faster than usual when it needed to. "You mind if I make some calls?" Dwayne asked. Beatrice blinked. "Why would you help me? You don't know me from Eve." "Because somebody should have stopped for you 3 days ago," Dwayne said. "And because I've got a grandmother somewhere probably, still mad at me for not visiting enough before she passed. This is the closest I'm going to get to fixing that." It wasn't a lie, and it wasn't the whole truth either, but it was enough for Beatrice, who nodded once, sharply, like a woman deciding to trust a stranger because the alternative was drowning alone. Dwayne called Roy that afternoon from the gas station parking lot, laying out what he knew. Roy, predictably, didn't hesitate. "Give me the attorney's name and the case number if there's a filing," Roy said. "I'll get Nadia on it tonight." Nadia Brooks turned out to be a legal aid lawyer with a caseload 3 times what any human should carry and a reputation, according to Roy, for eating predatory guardianship cases for breakfast. She agreed to meet Beatrice the next morning, free of charge, provided Dwayne could get her there. Beatrice's car, it turned out, had been sold by Randall 6 months earlier for her own safety, leaving her dependent on a bus route that didn't run near the legal aid office. That evening, Dwayne rode to Talbot Street to see the house for himself. It was a modest brick rancher with white trim gone slightly grey, a chain-link fence with a gate that stuck, and just as Beatrice had promised, a porch swing hanging from chains that had been oiled more recently than the rest of the property suggested. He sat on it for a moment, testing the weight, and it held steady, sturdy as the day it was built. Beatrice watched him from the doorway, her oxygen line trailing behind her like a leash she'd learned to live with. "He built that swing the summer we found out we couldn't have children," she said, not moving from the doorway. "Said if the house couldn't be full of kids, it could at least be full of quiet evenings. We sat on it every night for 40 years until he passed." "When was that?" 6 years ago. Randall started sniffing around about a year after. Said he was worried about me being alone. I believed him for a while." Her voice hardened. "Fool me." Dwayne stood, the swing creaking gently behind him. "Not a fool. Trusting. Different thing." She almost smiled. "You sound like my husband." "What was he like?" Dwayne asked, not because he needed to fill the silence, but because he genuinely wanted to know. "Stubborn. Quiet until he wasn't. He worked 40 years at the rail yard, came home every night smelling like grease and diesel, and never once complained about it because he said a man who complained about honest work didn't deserve to have it." Beatrice touched the arm of the swing lightly, the way someone might touch a photograph. "He'd have liked you. He didn't trust men who talked too much or smiled too easy. Said it usually meant they were selling something." "I'm not selling anything." "No," she agreed. "That's exactly why he'd have liked you." Over the following days, Dwayne found himself returning to Talbot Street more than his schedule had any business allowing. He fixed the sticking gate. He carried Beatrice's groceries in from a neighbor who'd started dropping off casseroles once she saw a motorcycle parked outside regularly, apparently deciding that anyone who visited that often couldn't be all bad. He sat with Beatrice while Nadia Brooks reviewed the power of attorney document line by line, her eyebrows climbing higher with every page. "This was drafted the week she was hospitalized," Nadia said, tapping the signature date. "There's a doctor's note in her file from 3 days before this was signed, stating she was, quote, confused and disoriented due to fever and medication. If that's accurate, this document is challengeable on grounds of incapacity at time of signing. And this," she flipped to the listing agreement Randall had already filed, "constitutes him acting outside a fiduciary's duty of good faith if the sale price is demonstrably below market, which, from what you've shown me, it clearly is." "So we can stop it," Dwayne said. "We can try. I can file an emergency petition to suspend the power of attorney and request a court-appointed guardian ad litem to evaluate her competency independently, which, frankly, any reasonable evaluation is going to find sound as a bell." Nadia looked at Beatrice, who sat straight-backed despite the tubing at her nose. "But it takes time we may not have. The closing's in 9 days now. I can request an emergency stay, but judges don't always move fast, and Randall's attorney will fight it." "What do you need to move faster?" Dwayne asked. Nadia considered him for a long moment, a biker in a leather cut, oil still under his fingernails from fixing an old woman's gait, asking how to outmaneuver a predatory nephew's lawyer. "I need eyes on that house so nobody tries to force entry or intimidate her before the hearing," she said finally. "And I need documentation, witnesses, dates, anything showing a pattern of isolation or coercion. If you're willing to keep showing up, that helps more than you'd think." Dwayne looked at Beatrice, at the porch swing behind her, at the crooked cardigan she'd since learned to button correctly because someone was finally around to notice when she didn't. "I'll keep showing up," he said. "I made a promise at a gas station. I don't break those." Nadia gathered her files, sliding them back into a battered leather satchel that had clearly seen 100 cases like this one and would see 100 more. "One more thing," she said, pausing at the door. "Randall doesn't know I've been retained yet. As far as he's aware, his aunt has been quietly falling in line. When he finds out otherwise, he's not going to take it well. Men like that rarely do. The ones who've built a plan around someone staying small and scared. I'd suggest you be here when he finds out, Mr. Kessler, not to intimidate him, just to make sure Mrs. Holloway isn't standing alone when the temperature in that conversation changes. Dwayne nodded once. I'll be here. Beatrice watched the two of them with something like wonder, as if she were still catching up to the fact that her gas station confession had produced an actual army, a legal aid attorney with a caseload she shouldn't have had room for, and a biker who kept showing up on a schedule nobody had asked him to keep. I don't know how to repay either of you, she said quietly. You don't, Nadia said, gathering her coat. That's the whole point of the work. Dwayne said nothing, but he thought about his grandmother again, about the visits he hadn't made, and understood that whatever debt he was paying wasn't really Beatrice's to owe. Randall Pruitt arrived on a Tuesday evening in a silver sedan that looked freshly detailed, wearing a golf polo and the practiced smile of a man who'd spent a career convincing people to sign things they hadn't fully read. He stopped short in the driveway when he saw the motorcycle parked at the curb and a broad-shouldered man in a leather cut sitting on the porch steps beside his aunt. "Who's this?" Randall asked, not quite masking the edge in his voice. "A friend," Beatrice said, and there was something in her tone, steel wrapped in politeness, that Dwayne hadn't heard from her before. "This is Dwayne. Dwayne, my nephew Randall." Randall extended a hand out of reflex more than courtesy, and Dwayne shook it once, firm, watching the younger man's eyes flick over his tattoos with the same calculation Dwayne had seen 100 times before. Threat assessment, followed by dismissal, followed by the assumption that this was a problem money could solve. "Aunt B, can we talk? Privately?" Randall said, glancing pointedly at Dwayne. "Anything you say to me, you can say in front of Dwayne," Beatrice said. "He's the one who's actually been checking on me. Unlike some people who only remember I exist when there's a house to sell." Randall's smile thinned. "That's not fair. I've been trying to protect you. The market's good right now. Interest rates are climbing, buyers are getting nervous, and this offer is 40% below what the Hendersons' house sold for 3 doors down." Beatrice cut in. "And I have a lawyer now who agrees." Something shifted behind Randall's eyes, a flicker of calculation replaced by something closer to panic, quickly smoothed over. "A lawyer? Since when do you have money for a lawyer? You said your accounts were tight." "They are tight," Beatrice said, "because you froze most of them. Funny how that works out, isn't it? You control my money, then act surprised when I struggle to hire someone to protect myself from you." Randall's jaw worked. He looked at Dwayne again, longer this time, and something in his posture shifted from irritated nephew to a man calculating leverage. "I don't know who put you up to this," he said to Dwayne, "but this is a family matter. My aunt isn't well. She needs care I'm trying to arrange, and frankly, having strange men hanging around her house at all hours isn't helping her case for independent living." "Strange men," Dwayne repeated evenly. "I've fixed her gate, carried her groceries, and sat with her while a lawyer read through paperwork you had her sign while she had 102 fever. Where were you during any of that?" "That's not—" Randall's composure cracked slightly. "You don't understand the whole situation." "Then explain it to me," Dwayne said, standing slowly, not aggressive, just present, the way a man his size didn't need to raise his voice to fill a doorway. "Explain why the listing went up before she signed anything giving you permission to sell. Explain why the offer's so far under market a blind appraiser could see it. Explain why her accounts froze right around the time she started asking questions." Randall's eyes darted toward the sedan, as if calculating how quickly he could retreat to it, then back toward his aunt, searching her face for some flicker of the compliant, grateful woman he'd apparently expected to find. "Meridian gave us a fast, guaranteed close," he said, the words coming faster now, rehearsed and thinning under pressure. "No inspection contingencies. No financing falling through at the last minute. I did my research. I talked to a financial advisor. Your financial advisor or hers? Beatrice asked. Because it certainly wasn't mine. I've never met the man. I was acting on your behalf. That's what power of attorney means, Aunt Bea. It means acting in my best interest, Beatrice snapped, her voice rising with a strength that seemed to surprise even her. Not yours. There's a difference, Randall, and you know it, or you wouldn't have waited until I had a fever to get me to sign anything. Randall's face went through several colors before settling on something pale and cornered. This is none of your business. She made it my business, Dwayne said, at a gas station when she grabbed my arm because nobody else would stop for her. That's on you, not me. A woman living alone for 3 days without anybody checking whether she made it home from a grocery run. That's not a nephew looking out for her best interest. That's a man waiting for a check to clear. For a moment, Dwayne thought Randall might swing at him. The man's hands had curled into fists at his sides, but whatever calculation ran through his head, self-preservation won out. Randall was not built for a fight he'd lose, and some animal part of him seemed to understand that clearly. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, Randall snapped, backing toward his car. Good, Beatrice called after him, her voice steady despite the tube at her nose. So will you when the hearing date comes. Nadia's already filed. Randall's sedan peeled out of the driveway hard enough to leave a thin scrape of rubber on the concrete, and the silence that followed felt like the whole street exhaling. Beatrice sank back into her chair, suddenly smaller, the adrenaline of confrontation draining out of her all at once. Dwayne crouched beside her, checking the oxygen line reflexively, the way he'd learned to over the past week. You okay? I haven't stood up to that boy in 6 years, she said, and her voice wavered now, some of the steel giving way to exhaustion. I forgot what it felt like. How's it feel? She managed a small, tired smile. Terrifying. Wonderful. That night, after Dwayne left, Nadia called with news that landed heavier than either of them expected. Randall's attorney had filed a motion to have Beatrice evaluated for a full guardianship, not just contesting the emergency stay, but seeking to have her declared legally incompetent altogether, which would strip her of the right to make any decisions at all about the house or anything else, permanently. He's not backing down, Nadia said grimly. He's doubling down. If a judge grants full guardianship to him, he won't need her signature for anything. He'll have total control. Dwayne sat on his own porch that night, engine cooling in the driveway, and thought about the 12 days that had already shrunk to 7, about a promise made to a stranger with cold, desperate hands, and understood that keeping it was about to get a lot harder than fixing a gate. He called Roy again, later than he probably should have. Full guardianship, Roy repeated low and grim on the other end of the line. That's not a nephew panicking anymore. That's a man who's decided the only way to win is to make sure she can't fight back at all. Nadia thinks we can beat it, says the evaluation's a formality when someone's as sharp as Beatrice is. Judges don't always see people the way lawyers expect them to, Roy said. Especially old women with oxygen tanks. Some part of that courtroom's going to look at her and see fragile before they see capable. You need to make sure that doesn't happen. You need her walking in there looking like exactly what she is. A woman who raised that boy's father, ran a household for 50 years, and isn't about to let anybody take the last thing her husband ever built for her. Dwayne looked out at the dark street, the porch light of his own quiet house doing little to push back the night. I'll make sure of it, he said, and meant it in a way that settled somewhere deep and unmovable in his chest. The Davidson County Courthouse smelled like floor wax and old paper, and Beatrice sat in the hallway outside courtroom 4B with her oxygen tank at her feet, dressed in a navy blazer she hadn't worn since her husband's funeral. Dwayne sat beside her, out of his cut, wearing the closest thing he owned to a suit, dark jeans and a button-down that Roy's wife had ironed for him that morning, muttering the whole time about men who didn't own irons. Randall sat across the hall with his attorney, a sharp-suited man who kept glancing at his watch as if the proceedings were an inconvenience between more important appointments. Nadia crouched in front of Beatrice, running through the plan one final time. The judge will hear from the court-appointed evaluator first. Dr. Whitfield did the competency assessment last week, and her report is strong. Then Randall's side will present their case for guardianship. Then you'll have the chance to speak, if you want to. I want to, Beatrice said without hesitation. Then we're ready. Inside, Judge Renata Ashworth reviewed the file with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen this exact scheme dozens of times before. A relative isolates an aging homeowner, secures legal authority during a moment of medical vulnerability, then moves quickly to liquidate assets before anyone can intervene. Dr. Whitfield's evaluation, read aloud into the record, described Beatrice as fully oriented to person, place, time and situation, with clear and consistent reasoning, exhibiting no cognitive impairment, consistent with dementia or diminished capacity. The evaluator herself, a soft-spoken woman with silver-rimmed glasses, took the stand briefly to answer the judge's questions directly. In 31 years of conducting competency evaluations, Dr. Whitfield said, Mrs. Holloway is among the sharpest individuals I've assessed, regardless of age. She correctly recalled dates, names, financial details from years prior, and articulated a clear understanding of the legal proceedings against her. Her physical condition, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease requiring supplemental oxygen, has no bearing whatsoever on her cognitive capacity. I want to be unambiguous about that, Your Honor, because I've seen courts conflate the two before, to the detriment of people who deserved better. A ripple of quiet moved through the gallery. Duane, watching from behind the plaintiff's table, saw Beatrice's shoulders straighten another inch. Randall's attorney tried a different angle, arguing that Beatrice's physical frailty, the oxygen dependency, a recent fall the previous winter, her age, made independent living inherently risky, regardless of her mental sharpness. My client acted in good faith to secure his aunt's safety, the attorney said. The house, frankly, is too much for a woman in her condition to maintain alone. Objection to the framing, Nadia said, rising. Physical frailty is not legal incompetence, and if it were, half this city's senior population would lose their civil rights along with their knees. Mrs. Holloway has arranged, at her own initiative, for home health assistance 3 days a week, which addresses any legitimate safety concern without requiring her to surrender her home or her autonomy. Randall's attorney pressed further, suggesting that the sudden appearance of legal representation and home health assistance was itself suspicious, evidence, he argued, of outside influence on a vulnerable woman rather than genuine independent choice. Your Honor, we'd ask the court to consider who benefits from this arrangement. My client's aunt has, in a matter of weeks, acquired a lawyer, a home health aide, and what appears to be a rather devoted new companion with no prior relationship to the family. That's a significant amount of sudden change for a woman my client describes as increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Nadia didn't miss a beat. Your Honor, isolation is precisely what my client was experiencing before Mr. Kessler and I became involved. Isolation created and maintained by the very nephew, now arguing that her sudden access to support is suspicious. I'd invite counsel to explain how connecting an isolated senior with legal counsel and medical support constitutes exploitation rather than the reversal of it. Judge Ashworth's eyebrows rose slightly. You've arranged home health care, Mrs. Holloway. Beatrice nodded. Started last week. A wonderful young woman named Patrice comes by Monday, Wednesday and Friday, checks my oxygen levels, helps with anything heavy. I don't need my nephew's permission to take care of myself. I never did. It was Duane, sitting quietly behind the plaintiff's table, who had actually made the calls to arrange it, another favor from Roy's network. This one, a home health agency that owed the Iron Veterans a debt after the club had spent a Saturday repairing the roof of their office building following a storm. But he let Beatrice claim the arrangement as her own, because it was hers now, regardless of who'd dialed the phone. When it came Beatrice's turn to speak, she stood without assistance, gripping the edge of the table only lightly, her oxygen line trailing behind her like a small act of defiance. "Your Honor, I raised that boy's father when their own mother couldn't. I sat with Randall in the hospital when he broke his arm, falling out of my own apple tree at 9 years old. I paid for part of his college when his parents came up short. I am not incompetent. I am not confused. I am 78 years old, with a bad set of lungs and a very clear mind, and I know exactly what my nephew is trying to do, because I watched the papers arrive the same week I was running a fever of 102 degrees, and I signed something I never should have signed, and I have spent 2 years too proud and too scared to admit it." Her voice caught, but she pushed through it. "That house is the only place my husband's hands ever touched that's still standing the way he left it. I'm not asking this court to punish my nephew. I'm asking this court to let an old woman keep the one thing she has left that still remembers him." The courtroom was silent, except for the soft mechanical hiss of her oxygen concentrator. Judge Ashworth took a long moment before speaking. "Based on Dr. Whitfield's evaluation, the documented timeline of the power of attorney's execution, and testimony presented today, this court finds insufficient grounds for guardianship. The existing power of attorney is hereby revoked, effective immediately. The listing agreement and pending sale of the property at 214 Talbot Street are void. Mrs. Holloway's competency and autonomy are affirmed in full." Randall's attorney began to object, but the judge lifted a hand. "I'd also note for the record that pursuing guardianship proceedings against a demonstrably competent adult, timed suspiciously close to a below-market property sale, raises questions this court takes seriously. Mrs. Holloway's counsel is welcome to pursue any civil remedies she sees fit regarding the frozen accounts and the original power of attorney's execution." It was over in minutes, the way most quiet victories were. No dramatic gavel slamming, just a judge's steady voice undoing 2 years of fear with a handful of sentences. Outside the courthouse, Beatrice gripped Dwayne's arm again, the same way she had at the gas station, except this time her hand wasn't shaking from fear. "You kept your promise," she said. "Told you I would." 6 weeks later, Dwayne pulled up to 214 Talbot Street on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of warm, easy day that made Nashville feel briefly generous. The neighborhood had changed in small ways since the hearing. The Hendersons, 3 doors down, had put up a new mailbox. Someone had finally trimmed the overgrown hedge on the corner lot, and word had apparently spread among the neighbors about what had almost happened to Beatrice, because 2 different households had started leaving casseroles and garden tomatoes on her porch without being asked, the way small communities sometimes remembered how to look out. For their own, once somebody showed them, it still mattered. The chain-link gate swung open without sticking now. He'd replaced the hinge properly instead of just oiling it, and the porch swing creaked its familiar rhythm as Beatrice waved him toward the empty seat beside her. She looked better than she had at the gas station, Dwayne thought. Not stronger exactly. The oxygen tank still hummed at her side, the tube still ran beneath her nose, and her hands still trembled faintly when she reached for her tea. But there was color in her face now that hadn't been there before, and something loose and unguarded in her shoulders that hadn't been there either. "Patrice says my numbers are better than they've been in a year," Beatrice said, patting the oxygen tank beside her like an old friend rather than a burden. "Says stress does more damage to old lungs than people give it credit for." "Makes sense," Dwayne said, settling into the swing, testing the weight the same way he had the first evening he'd sat there. It held, same as always. "Stress'll wear down anything. People, houses, engines. You'd know about engines." I'd know about engines. They sat in comfortable quiet for a while, watching a neighbor's dog chase something invisible across the yard next door, the late afternoon light turning gold across the brick and the trimmed hedges Duane had helped tame the previous weekend, mostly because Beatrice had mentioned once that her husband used to keep them sharp and precise, and some habits deserved honoring even after the person who started them was gone. "Randall called last week," Beatrice said eventually. Duane's jaw tightened slightly. What did he want? To apologize, sort of. She made a small, dismissive sound. Said he'd gotten in over his head financially, some bad investments, and panicked, and told himself he was doing it for my own good because that made it easier to swallow. I told him I appreciated the honesty, 6 years and 1 lawsuit too late, and that he could start rebuilding trust by returning what he took from my accounts, in full, with the interest Nadia calculated. And he's paying it back, slowly. Nadia's making sure of that. Beatrice looked out over the yard, her expression unreadable for a moment. I don't hate him, you know. I'm angry. I don't think I'll ever fully trust him again. But he's still the boy who broke his arm in my apple tree. People get scared, and they do ugly things with that fear. Doesn't make it right, but it makes it human. Duane thought about that for a while, about the years he'd spent assuming the worst of people who assumed the worst of him first, about how easy it was to let a cycle like that just keep spinning if nobody ever chose to step outside it. "You're a better person than most," he said. "I'm a stubborn old woman with decent lungs and worse patience," Beatrice said, "but I'll take the compliment." A motorcycle engine rumbled somewhere down the street, and a moment later Roy pulled up on his own bike, parking it behind Duane's at the curb. He climbed off, offering Beatrice a small wave and a nod that carried the particular respect the club reserved for people who'd earned it the hard way. "Y'all having a meeting without me?" Roy called, ambling up the walkway. "Just a Sunday," Duane said. "Mrs. Holloway, that swing still holds up after 50 years, huh?" Roy asked, settling onto the porch steps. 52, this fall, Beatrice corrected, and there was pride in it, the specific pride of a woman who had fought to keep the number counting upward instead of stopping cold. "My husband built things to last. Guess I inherited some of that stubbornness." "Guess you did," Duane said. A screen door creaked 2 houses down, and a woman in gardening gloves, one of the neighbors who'd started leaving tomatoes on Beatrice's porch, waved across the yards before returning to her flower bed. Beatrice waved back, unhurried, the gesture of someone who no longer had to wonder whether anyone was paying attention to her comings and goings. "Funny thing," Beatrice said, watching the woman go. "Nobody on this street said 2 words to me the whole year. Randall had me convinced I was a burden. Then the hearing happened, word got around the way it does, and suddenly I've got more tomatoes than I know what to do with." She shook her head slowly. "People aren't bad mostly. They're just busy, or scared, or waiting for permission to care about something that isn't theirs to fix. You gave me that permission, showing up the way you did. Reminded the whole street it was allowed to notice an old woman living alone. Didn't do it for the street," Duane said. "Did it for you." "I know," Beatrice said. "That's what made the difference." Roy chuckled, leaning back against the porch railing. "This one's always been like that. Quietest guy in the club until something's actually wrong, and then you can't get him to stand down for love or money." He glanced at Duane with the particular fondness of a man who'd ridden beside someone through enough bad years to trust him without needing to say so. "Iron Veterans did a run last month for a burn unit up in Clarksville. Raised about $6,000 in an afternoon. People see 40 bikes roll into a parking lot and they brace for trouble. Then they find out it's a bunch of grown men buying stuffed animals for kids in the ICU, and their whole idea of what we are just falls apart." "Guess that's the theme of the summer," Beatrice said, smiling faintly, things falling apart in the right direction for once. The 3 of them sat there as the afternoon eased toward evening, the swing creaking its steady rhythm, the oxygen concentrator humming its quiet accompaniment, and somewhere down the block, a car passed slow enough for its driver to glance twice at the motorcycles parked outside an old woman's house, the same kind of glance Dwayne had spent 22 years learning to ignore, except now, for the first time in a long while, he found he didn't mind it at all. Because some houses were just houses, and some were something worth a promise, kept by a stranger who'd stopped when everyone else kept walking, and by a woman who'd had exactly enough fight left in her to grab the one arm that would. The swing held. It always had.